Hello, beautiful people, and welcome.
Hi.
To the Nilou Post-Release. I haven't actually played any Nilou since the first impressions video, but I have had a lot of conversations about her. I've talked about her, I've looked at what other people think, and I've got a decent enough understanding of her to go through the pre-release, talk about the things I got right and the things I got wrong. That being said, do keep in mind that a lot of what is going to basically decide how good the Nilou teams are is her synergies with Nahida, which is scheduled to come out next batch. I'll have a Nahida pre-release video coming out soon, so I'll talk about some interactions with Nilou there, and I'll also be talking about the Nilou and Nahida interaction on the Nahida post-release once Nahida's out. So just do keep in mind that we don't have a full picture yet. Anyways, let's get into it. I wanted to wait until we had Nahida leaks because unlike Cyno, where I didn't expect Nahida to really change the way you want to build his teams, I most definitely did expect Nahida to change the way you build Nilou's teams. The reason why Nahida doesn't really change the way you build Cyno's teams is because Cyno's an on-fielder. You kind of can't play any off-field Cyno bullshit, which means that you have to play off-field Nahida, which means that her purpose in a team is going to be the same thing as Dendro main character. She's just there to apply Dendro and get some damage, which is nice, I guess, but nothing else. Whereas in Nilou teams, because Nilou can get some value without being on-field, then Nahida can be played on-field, and if you play on-field Nahida, then you've got a lot more Dendro application, which could justify going only one Dendro unit instead of two, which obviously is going to be making the way that you build your teams very different, because you've got 3 Hydros instead of 2. That gives you access to basically all the Hydro units instead of basically being forced to Nilou plus 1 healer. Anyways, we'll get more into it a bit later. Now, putting aside balance for a second, I want to talk about design, because I think this is really bad design. I will be talking about this more in a video where I'm doing a design tier list for gameplay design and kit design. My thoughts on units design. There's too many characters in the game, so I decided to do it just on the Hydro characters, but that's already been recorded. I don't know exactly when it will come out, but you can look forward to that. My advice to you would be wait for her rerun. Make sure you have the pieces that surround her before you actually get her. Yeah, I do stand by that. Her teams with Collei and Dendro, MC, and Barbara, they are functional. They're just not as good. And right now in this Abyss, they don't feel that bad because the first side is, perfect for her. On every chamber, it's 4 or more enemies that spawn close together. And it's yeah, obviously, she's gonna function there, even if the team isn't that good, because that's her niche. But you'll see once we start moving into Abysses that aren't exactly like that. Collei, Dendro, MC, Barbara is just not gonna, it's not gonna perform very well anymore. So basically, you press E, and then after that, you can either mash your normal attack button or mash your skill button, your E button. About that, dude, I got a really angry comment from someone that said that I was a disappointment to Theorycrafting. I don't know, they deleted the comment, so I can't actually quote it, but I got a really angry comment because I didn't mention that you can make Nilou's E animation a little bit faster if you alternate between E and right click. Just gotta make sure that you use the right one on the last step and you'll still get the buff that you want to get. You can gain an incredibly small amount of time by alternating your clicks. I mean, it is a useful thing to know if you're going to be playing her. It doesn't really change much, but I guess it is useful to know. Nothing crazy. I'd say it's probably better for Vape Nilou than for Bloom Nilou, which is kind of funny. Yeah, okay. I definitely stand by that. One thing to keep in mind is that when you're playing Bloom teams, the ideal situation is that Nilou doesn't get blooms because Nilou has to be built with full HP, and that full HP increases your whole team's bloom damage by the same amount, which means that she can't build full EM. So in a perfect world, you would have a full EM different character that can take Nilou's buff and their own full EM to get their blooms to do a lot of damage. Now, if Nilou has her Tranquility Aura, then she is kind of yoinking some of those, which is not good. The thing is, she doesn't yoink that many, so it isn't actually a big problem. And most of the time, at least right now, you're kind of stuck. Playing only one Dendro, you're not gonna have enough Hydro, which means that you have to go 2 Dendros. And if you do go 2 Dendros, you kind of don't have that much Hydro, which means that you're gonna end up with not enough Hydro to actually get as many blooms as you you could, like, theoretically get with the amount of Dendro you have, which means that the Tranquility Aura lasting longer will actually get you more blooms, and it's not gonna steal reactions, which is good. With Nahida, that might actually not be the case. Once Nahida comes out, if you end up on-fielding your Nahida, it is very possible that you're gonna want to use a Hydro unit, full EM, and you're actually going to, because you can now have 3 Hydro units, you are gonna have enough Hydro to actually get your, like, consume all of the Dendro aura. And if you do, then this lasting longer will mean that Nilou is going to be getting blooms instead of a different Hydro character, which is bad, actually. Now, this kind of stuff is really difficult to predict accurately because it's behaviors of auras over, like, long periods of times when you're playing stuff like Cyno that don't actually have constant application, where it depends on how much you attack, how much you have to dodge, because that's going to delay your application somewhat. And so actually predicting exactly how much of an increase or decrease this is basically impossible without a lot of playtesting. And obviously Nahida's not out, so there hasn't been any playtesting. But I just want you guys to remember that the Tranquility Aura lasting longer isn't actually necessarily a good thing, which means that there very well might be teams where her Constellation 1 is a damage loss. Again, though, that being said, it also very well might not be. When it comes to AoE, if you end up using Cyno, most of his Hydro application is single target, which means that you are still likely in AoE going to have more Dendro Aura than you know what to do with on enemies that are not your primary target, the one that you're not normal attacking. And then her E lasting longer is just going to get you more things. Anyways, point being, in Bloom teams, it can be good, it can be bad. It's going to depend. Now, it does say affected by the Golden Chalice's bounty, which means that this will only work if you're playing a Dendro and Hydro team, so you don't get the Hydro res shred if you're playing her in a vape team, basically. That part is just sad. It's like, bruh. I haven't actually tested it, so maybe it's a, like, translation issue and it actually works in vape teams. I'm sorry, I'm not a whale. Completely dogshit post-release. Didn't even actually test Constellation 2. Bad streamer. Unsubscribe. Thank you, El Reaper. So we have confirmation apparently that the C2 does indeed not work in vape. Enemies generally have around 10% res, both the Hydro and Dendro. And then with Nilou, remove another 35. So the most relevant part is the Dendro, because obviously when you're playing Nilou teams, generally your Hydro characters are built with a lot of EM and not for talent damage, which means that most of their damage is actually still Dendro and not Hydro. So it is a useful constellation, but because enemies generally have 10% Dendro resistance, and because the Deepwood set is always something you'll have on your team, that 35% res shred is not 35% more damage, it's about 16, which is obviously good, right? 16% team DPS is quite nice, but it's not insane. Like, do keep that in mind. Oh, by the way, there's currently a bug. There's a bug on her burst where sometimes it just doesn't hit. Like, it just, you press Q, the enemy's right next to you, it does the animation, the enemy doesn't take damage. And then they also don't take the second hit because it's like the first hit didn't hit. Hopefully they fix it, because like, bro, what the fuck? And then crit based on how much HP she has. Yeah, so the C6 is just a vape constellation. It's not very relevant in Bloom teams, because in most Bloom teams, you don't actually stay on her, because it's just not worth it. Her damage is too bad. In vape teams, you can make it worth to stay on her. And then if you have C6, that's obviously a pretty big increase to your DPS. Oh yeah, one other thing. Nahida's Constellation 2 makes Bloom type reactions able to crit. So you might see her C6 and be like, wait, that's a lot of crit rate and crit damage for my blooms once I get Nahida C2. No, it's not, all right? Nahida's Constellation 2 has a fixed critical rate and critical damage, which means that your actual stats for crit do not matter for your Bloom crit, which means that this will not affect the Bloom crit, okay? Don't get baited, please. So honestly, that's like the biggest problem with Nilou's constellations, is that her C1, it doesn't do much for Bloom teams, and for Bloom teams, there might actually be situations where it actually like makes her teams worse, but it's quite good for vape teams. Her C2 does not function in vape teams, but it's quite good for Bloom teams. Her C3 doesn't do much in Bloom teams and is decent for vape teams. Same for her C4, same for her C5, same for her C6. So her C1, 3, 4, 5, 6 are mostly vape constellations, and her C2 is a Bloom constellation. So her constellations don't actually do the same thing. Like, if you're a whale going for Nilou because you want the Bloom teams, there's actually no point to going past C2 because the other constellations don't do much for the Bloom teams. If you actually end up going for C6 Nilou, Nilou. She's obviously gonna be pretty good in vape teams because 65% more damage, the talent levels, more damage on your burst, and then like 50% more DPS from the C6. Like that adds up, and it actually makes her pretty decent. It also makes it so that her burst nuke becomes relatively like solid, relatively strong. We'll talk about the burst scaling eventually, I think. So I'll explain it a little bit more once we get to that. But Vape Nilou is not very good. It's not that it's not playable, it's definitely playable, but it's one of those examples of a team that kind of gets hard carried by Bennett Xiangling, and where you put a last unit in, and the last unit can kind of be whatever because the rest of your team already does enough damage, but in reality, you'd likely get better results out of a different last unit than Nilou. That being said, because the core is so strong, that doesn't matter that much, and so if you want to go for a Nilou vape team, it is still definitely functional. When it comes to bloom teams, what you'll notice is that they're not very good in single target because you just don't trigger enough blooms. So most of the time you'll want to be playing them in AoE where you can trigger blooms on multiple different enemies and effectively scale your damage up higher. You know what? There is actually one thing I want to show.
Following order.
There we go. That shows it quite well. As you can see right there, I got a lot of bloom seeds, and not only that, but it felt like they did damage more often than they should. Because Nilou applies Hydro to nearby enemies every 2 seconds, which means that I should only get a bloom proc and bloom damage every 2 seconds, right? Well, not quite. Because the reality is, the way that she applies Hydro is she hits nearby enemies every 0.5 seconds with Hydro, with Wet, but it has an internal cooldown, which means that it only actually applies the Hydro status, or the Wet status, every 2 seconds. That being said, if you apply it to one enemy, and then move a little bit more forward, apply it to the second enemy, move a little bit more forward, applying to the third enemy, and so on, you can actually make it so that each different hit, each different 0.5 second hit, is hitting at a different time. So you get Hydro up on one, but not on the others because they're not hit yet. Then you get Hydro up on the second one, but not on the first one because it's on internal cooldown, so it won't actually like trigger a reaction. And then on the third one, and then on the fourth one. And if you've got, for example, 8 enemies at the same time, and you do 2 enemies, and then 2 enemies, and then 2 enemies, and then 2 enemies, you can actually get the equivalent of 2 bloom reactions in AoE every 0.5 seconds. Effectively, you make your internal cooldown shorter. Because here's the thing, right? If you actually get 3 at the same time, we got 5 here, right? All at the same time, the enemies only take 2 instances of damage each. But because Nilou's Hydro up from her ring can have some like delay on it between the enemies, you can make it so that the same Hydro up hits at different times and you actually get a bloom damage on each instead of only on the one. Anyways, point being, when there's more than 2 enemies, if you stagger your application between 2 of the enemies and then another 2 enemies and then maybe another 2 enemies, you get more bloom damage than usual. Which is part of the reason why in this abyss, Nilou teams are performing so well. Because you're getting 4+ enemies that actually group together. You're getting actually enough enemies for this trick to actually matter. Now, let me be clear, this is obviously a thing that is good for her, right? Having that possibility is good for her. It makes her able to perform better in practice than if you just assumed 2 enemies when there are a lot of enemies. But also, that thing she is currently benefiting from in this specific abyss, and she will not always be benefiting from. So just keep that in mind when you see showcases of her. This is her niche. This is where she is really, really good. I mean, I guess we can show that it works with Barbara as well. And you're just dashing between the enemies like that. It is pretty funny, to be fair. Arguably, it's the best way to play these teams, which is fucking hilarious. If I actually, like, take it seriously. Another advantage of this is that you can swap between your units, which is good because you're taking a lot of damage, so being able to swap between your units means that you don't die. And Barbara's burst heals your whole team, so if all of your units are taking some damage, that's nice. If you can spend some time on Nilou, that has a lot of HP, so she can actually tank some damage, that's also nice. Especially with Barbara, this is generally the best way to play these teams, so just keep that in mind. I don't want the post-release to just be like, hey, I know you've seen people saying she's broken because of how fast she can clear the current abyss. She's actually not broken, which, like, yeah, but also I don't want that to be the only thing I say, you know? I don't want that to be the only focus of the post-release, because while I do think that she's being definitely like oversold, overrated by some people, she also is being underrated by others. And judgment on her power aside, I think a lot of people misunderstand how you're actually supposed to play her. And if you're playing double Dendro, those two, you're applying it, right? Nahida's like at least 6, DMC's at least 8. This was done before Nahida got her buffs, by the way. So I say at least 6. It's going to be more now because they buffed her E. They made it so that it hits slightly slower, but they removed the internal cooldown, which means that instead of one application every 3.8 seconds, you get one application every 2.5 seconds. A little bit more because it'll cool down on the proc, so it's 2.5 plus, so it's generally more going to be like 2.7, 2.8, but still, you get the idea. It's not going to be 6 anymore. She gets 1 from her E cast, and then she'll get like 8-ish from the procs. Yeah. One other thing that I haven't talked about that is worth mentioning is if you are on-fielding your Nilou with her Hydro normal attacks, because her auto attack range is relatively small, it is very possible that in your normal attack combo, your first attack hits 1 or 2 enemies, and then your second attack hits 3 enemies instead, because one of the enemies walked up to you. If that happens, then that third enemy is going to, I mean, if you trigger Bloom on them, that third enemy is going to have the same mechanic we talked about earlier of you trigger the Bloom at a different time, even if it's kind of like the same quote-unquote ICD, because it's on a different hit, you can actually increase the total amount of Blooms that you get that way as well. But yeah, that means that when you're against 2 targets, your damage per
okay,
so that's assuming that your Hydro application is the same on all enemies, and like I just explained, that won't always be the case. There are a lot of Hydro units that have a lot of Hydro hits, but only some of them apply their element. So I've already talked about Barbara, I've already talked about Nilou, but there are actually others. If you use Kandaka's Hydro Infusion, any character that where their normal attacks will sometimes hit 1, sometimes 2, whatever, you can actually stagger your ICD to get Hydro hits at different times. Kokomi's normal attacks, if you attack one enemy and then a different enemy, the combo that people generally do on Kokomi is N2 dash or N2 walk. If you do that and you actually like do N2 on one enemy and then on another and then on another and so on and so forth, you can actually get your blues a little bit more reliably, but it's single target, so it doesn't matter that much. Ayato actually matters a lot. He has the same mechanic with his E, where if your first slash of your E hits 1 enemy and then your second slash hits 3, then you get 1 bloom on the first hit, and then you get 2 blooms on the second hit, and because you're not generating 3 blooms at the same time, they're staggered, you'll get your bloom damage from the first one, and then 2 blooms damage from the second hit. You will actually be getting 3 blooms from one, quote-unquote, one Hydro application. Ayato's burst can also work like that, where if it falls, it hits one enemy, and then it falls, it hits a different enemy. If there's 2 enemies here, 2 enemies here, you can actually get it to work the same way. Point being, this is a mechanic that can actually apply to a lot of the Hydro units. It can apply to Child as well, although generally Child's Hydro application is just too much for it to matter. That being said, I know that there are like whales that care about these pre-releases and post-releases, so if you are a whale, Child's Constellation 4, if you end up applying Riptide to enemies at different intervals, like you, for example, you press E, you attack one enemy, and then another, and then another, you can actually get some staggered Hydro application the same way from his C4, which is going to trigger either the Charge Shot Riptide if you're in range stance or not on Child, or the melee Riptide if you're in melee form. But you can actually use off-field Child as a form of Hydro application if you have C4, and if you stagger your Riptide application between different enemies, you can actually get a lot more seeds. Same for Barbara that I've already talked about, same for Xingqiu's orbitals. That being said, So the blooms can actually remove his rain swords, which means that if you play him in bloom teams, his rain swords won't last that long because your blooms will just remove them. There's an ICD on how often they can be removed, but if you have a lot of blooms in your Nilou teams, then they won't last very long. Support weapons can actually end up being better, even on-field, right? Because all of this is on-field Nilou. If you're not on-field Nilou, her personal damage fucking tanks. Yeah, and that's assuming you use burst every rotation, which you don't even really want to because your burst is just more hydro up, which means that Nilou is going to be yoinking more of your blooms, and potentially you'll actually lose your Dendro aura, which is generally not what you want. And then on top of that, the damage that it does just isn't that good. If you're getting 15 of those, single target, wow, 400k DPR, that's a lot, right? Well, not really. It's good, but you also have to keep in mind that your Nilou doesn't really have any personal damage. Your Dendro units are built full EM, so they don't have much personal damage either. Basically, you don't want to build your your Dendro units full EM and your Hydro units damage, like HP or attack damage crit. That's generally not what you want to be doing in your teams, because building a Dendro unit full EM just means you just don't get enough seeds. Like, you can still get a decent-ish amount, but if you're playing a Nilou team where you're getting decent results in her niche, in AoE, it's like, why? So you can build EM on your Dendro units, and that's okay, but ideally you're gonna want to have your Hydro units be the trigger, which means that you'll want your Hydro units to be the one that are built EM. That being said, Nahida's kind of an exception because for her, EM is kind of like attack because she has direct EM scaling, and then on top of that, she has an EM conversion to damage and crit, which means that it's actually even better than attack. And so on Nahida, you might want to go EM anyways, just because EM is really good on her. You need your Hydro application to actually hit them all, which is gonna be fucking, yeah, which is the one that's basically very difficult. If you go double Dendro, it's hard to provide enough Hydro, which means that generally if you go double Dendro, you're either, if you don't pay too much attention to who's proccing what, you're either gonna get your proc alternating between your Dendro and Hydro, which really sucks because it means that you have to build EM on all of your characters, which isn't as good, or you'll have your Hydro characters being the ones that are the trigger, which is good, but you also do have to keep in mind that Nilou herself can't build that much EM because you want to build her HP. That's the biggest problem with Theorycrafting Nilou before her release, is that so much of this stuff is so like intricately linked to how consistently you can get your AoE to hit that it's really hard to draw a conclusion beforehand. Yeah, so even after her release, it is still hard to draw accurate conclusions because the current Abyss is just fucking designed to sell Nilou. And even then, it doesn't seem like they're doing that good of a job, right? Her banner sales, I saw a graph that said that her banner sales were like pretty bad. I don't know how reliable that is, but yeah. Your Nilou needs to be full HP though. So she's not really getting much EM on herself, so maybe she's getting like 100 from substats. Okay, that's wrong. After thinking about it more, and especially because of what I talked about earlier, being the way that you can, when you have a lot of enemies, stagger your Hydro hits to get more seeds out of Nilou than you generally would be able to, or to get all of your seeds to do damage, even when you have more than 2 enemies. The value of EM becomes a lot higher, especially in teams where your Hydro trigger, or I mean only in teams where your Hydro trigger, but still, you get the idea. But it actually becomes better to the point where you actually kind of want EM in your substats, and if you're looking for EM in your substats and they're the main substats you're looking for, you will get more than 100. Realistically, if you're going for HP pieces that have EM substats, you can probably get an average of 40 EM per artifact, which would be closer to 2 to 250 because your Flower and Feather, you're likely to be able to get more. Maybe not though, because you kind of want HP percent more than EM on your Flower and Feather. It's just you don't care about HP on your other artifacts because you already have HP percent main stat. You can't get it in substats. You still want flat HP, but EM is also good. Anyways, point being, you're probably getting more than 100 from your substats. It's probably closer to 200. It can actually even be more than that. Instructor set can be difficult to trigger because you need to actually trigger a reaction to get the set. And if you're playing Hydro triggers, you don't want your Hydro units to be on Instructor because you want them to be on Gilded, which means that you want your Dendro unit on Instructor. But if you're playing Hydro trigger, it could actually be difficult to get your Dendro unit to trigger a reaction. But if you can find a rotation that works for you with Instructor, that's a good thing to get. And I added the 100 EM you get from your total EM, right? You can get around 200 from subs. You'll get 80 from a 2-piece Wanderers if you go for 2-piece Wanderers, and you can get 100 from her passive. That being said, you can also get, if you have C4 Collei, Collei, you can get like splash EM from that. You can get Instructor if you have a Sapwood, but generally you wouldn't want her to catch the Sapwood. But because you've got a bunch of different possible sources, let's say you get an average of 50 from something else, whatever. So you can actually get up to like 20-ish K on your Nilou's blooms herself. If you go for her signature weapon, right, which makes your blooms actually hit for a reasonable amount, not that far behind what your Kokomi would get, for example, with around 1250. It'd probably be more because of the key, 1350, something like that. Anyways, point being, the damage that Nilou gets from the blooms is a bit higher than I've said here, especially the damage that she gets from blooms if she goes for her signature weapon. How many applications are you getting? Nilou gets 8. Kokomi, generally your E isn't actually triggering reactions. You don't really want it to. It's not that you hate it, but generally you just open your rotation with it. But because of hydro trigger stuff, this 8, which should be 6, even that 6, right? If you're in like 4 targets, that 6 can actually become 24 if you stagger your application between the 2 enemies, which actually kind of skyrockets the damage. So let's move on to what you can do with on-field Nahida and triple Hydra. Now, unfortunately, I realize that I'm talking about Nahida a lot, and the reality is I need to. The other options that you'll have is to use Collei instead of Nahida, and honestly, I wouldn't recommend that. Yeah, so Collei just really fucking sucks. Like, obviously, if you don't have Nahida, you don't have another option because you don't want to go for triple Hydro. But like, you're not actually going to get significantly better results if you just never swap into Collei. What she helps do is make sure that you don't lose your Dendro aura and that you keep getting your Hydro triggers, which will matter sometimes, but it won't even matter that much. Her AoE is really small, her application is front-loaded, and you have to actually swap back into her to get it again, and it doesn't last very long. It's just not that insane for bloom stuff. Basically, Collei is like fine to have on your team, but she's not helping much, and there will be a pretty big difference between using Collei and using Nahida. On Nahida, unlike the other teams we've looked at, if you're trying to build Nahida as a bloom trigger, she's a bloom trigger that is on field, so she actually gets her own buff. One of Nahida's passives is that your on-field character gains elemental mastery. These things are technically true, but I was wrong for the way that these teams are going to end up playing out. I didn't give much thought to Nahida's E and the way that it worked because I hadn't like actually internalized that it was 1.5U and it was like pre-buff as well, so it applied it less often. But even then, I kind of papega'd on this because you're not getting Nahida to actually be trigger very often. The reality is the trigger condition on Nahida's E for it to apply Dendro is that you trigger a reaction, and you can't trigger a reaction unless you're attacking with Nahida, right? If you trigger Dendro onto Hydro, you remove the aura, you will get a bloom on Nahida, but then you apply 1.5 units of Dendro, which is going to be the aura, so she won't be the trigger for the next 3 bloom reactions. If you start with a Dendro aura and you apply Hydro, it procs Nahida's E, it refreshes the Dendro aura, fills it to 1.5U, technically 1.2, but whatever. Point being, you're actually not going to have a lot of ownership on Nahida with your reactions. Most of your ownership is likely going to be on your Hydro units. You might get some on Nahida, but most of it will be on the Hydro units. You're gonna want to have a Deepwood set on your team, but because Nilou's not doing much personal damage herself, you can actually just put her on Deepwood if you need to. Or you can put Kokomi on Deepwood because she's also not doing that much damage when you don't play her on field. And then you that is definitely not actually going to be what you want to do generally. I think that you'll generally want to have Nahida on Deepwood for reasons I'll explain. Nahida's Elemental Mastery Ascension and 200 Elemental Mastery from her passive. That was pre-buff, so now it's 250, not 200. And if we go back to even damage with your very cool. What I'm getting at here is that because when you have Dendro Aura, you can get 2 bloom reactions per Dendro unit applied, and when it's Hydro Aura, it's only 1. Then even if your Hydro characters are not built with EM, getting them to proc the blooms isn't actually much of a damage loss. Now, while true, this isn't useful information because, like I just said earlier, I kind of misunderstood / fucked up the reaction mapping, and what's actually going to happen is that most of your reactions will be owned by your Hydro unit, which means if you're getting, let's say you're using Nilou, Kokomi, Xingqiu. If you're in AoE, you're getting Nilou like 6 apps generally-ish in AoE on 2 enemies, that can be 12. On more enemies, if you manage to stagger your application, you can actually get even higher. Let's say 12 for now. Kokomi Kokomi can get 1 every 2 seconds, that's up to 10. Because of the way your rotations work, you might get a little bit less, let's say 8. If they hit an AoE, that's 16. And then Cyno is not going to be hitting an AoE, but he can actually get quite a few. So let's say he gets another like 15 from his stuff. Very approximative on the Cyno side, but whatever. But that's already a total of 43 blooms. And most of these are actually going to happen as is. Realistically, some of those blooms will actually be lost because you get the timing on your Dendro application to actually have the Hydro overtake. And so realistically, it's more going to be like 35-ish, maybe 30-ish, with another like 5-ish. This is like incredibly approximative because I haven't seen any footage of Nilou Bloom teams with Nahida, but this is more or less what I'm expecting. And what's gonna happen with this is you can actually get these 30-ish procs. And then if you build your Hydro units with full EM, your Nilou you kind of can't. So let's say you get actually like 8-ish from Nilou, maybe 12 from Kokomi, and 10 from Cyno, something like that, and then 5 from Nahida. If you build them all full EM, right, other than Nilou, Nilou's gonna get around 15,000, maybe a bit more. We said we got to around 19,000 earlier. Kokomi can get up to 35k. Cyno, if you don't build him with EM, is gonna be around 15. Nahida, you are building her with EM, but you're probably not going full EM, but it's probably like 30k or something. And that's a lot of bloom damage. And if you end up going EM on Cyno instead, you can get even more. And it can be even better in AoE. The thing is, unironically, I'm not entirely sure Cyno is going to be the best play. He's probably going to be the best option in single target. But in AoE, here's the problem, right? If you do get something like this, you're doing about 40k self damage to your characters every rotation. And the problem with that is this doesn't get reduced by damage reduction that Cyno has. And if your Kokomi is built full EM, she's healing maybe 3k per tick. And you're getting 10 heals per rotation, which means you're healing for 30k and you're self damaging for 40. Which means that even if you don't get hit, you'll die eventually. Cyno adds another like 5-ish k, but you're reliant on having HP subsets on your Kokomi just to go net neutral in HP. And this is assuming you don't end up using the Nilou trick to get more blooms. If you do, that can be even more. So, unironically, this might be the play. Either reducing your Kokomi damage by not going full EM and getting either 1, 2, maybe even 3 pieces that focus on her healing, or replacing your Cyno for a second healer. Don't get me wrong, if you get enough substats on your Kokomi, you can go net neutral or even slightly positive, but even then, you gotta not die. And on top of that, you gotta make sure that you're not taking it at the wrong moment because you're gonna be on-fielding with Nahida most of the time, and Nahida is not very tanky. So if you take too much at the same time, well, that's difficult. Most of your bloom reactions are happening when Nahida's on field, but you'll still spend a decent amount of time rotating through your team to get your skills and bursts activated, which means that she's likely taking a higher percentage of the bloom self damage than of the self healing, which could make it even more difficult. Anyways, point being, if you on-field Nahida, you might actually end up getting so many blooms that your self damage is higher than your self healing, which is funny, but not fun. So you might want to consider a double Hydro healer team. There's also another thing that I should mention for those triple Hydro teams. Nahida's normal attack AoE is pretty small, so you might actually end up in situations where your ownership goes all over the place and Nahida ends up owning some. But again, right, this is the kind of stuff that's really, really difficult to predict before actually seeing it in action. Since you're going for a fast Dendro, you're either yeah. So again, right, this is kind of fucking dumb because of the exact like way that Nahida's app works. The actual things that you can expect is you can expect 2 Dendro, 2 Hydro, and then you can either go Hydro trigger or mixed trigger. Hydro trigger will be better, harder to play. Mixed trigger is like meh, but brain dead to play. Right, effectively you just build EM on your Dendro units as well, so that if you fuck up your Hydro trigger, it's not the end of the world. You still get damage out of it. Your other option is 1 Dendro, 3 Hydro, Dendro trigger, Nahida, or sorry, not Dendro, sorry, Hydro trigger with Nahida. Good, might, toaster bath, and then Dendro trigger, DMC. No, don't do this. It's not good. 2 Dendro, 2 Hydro. You're better off using Nahida than Collei for both of these, but Collei still works for both of these, so it's fine if you, even if you don't. 1 Dendro, 3 Hydro. Hydro trigger, it has to be Nahida, and Dendro trigger kinda sucks, right? Whether it's off-field Nahida or Dendro main character, it's just not something that's very good. But yeah, so in the pre-release, I said Dendro trigger. That's probably not going to be the case, or it's going to be the case for some of the blooms, but most of them will be Hydro trigger. Mist splitter. Okay, weapons is an interesting thing, but if I were to do the weapon rank ranking now, I'd probably do Key, best in slot, Fav, good, Zyphos, good, then Freedom Sworn, good, then honestly Iron Sting, fine, free to play, Sack, meh, Jade Cutter, good in Vape, Festering, okay in Vape, Mist Splitter, okay in Vape. And yeah, there's also Traveler's Handy Sword, but I don't know how I feel about it. It's not a bad idea, but it requires you to on-field Nilou. Yeah, it's a defense sword that heals you when you gain particles. It's good if you on-field Nilou, but I don't think you want to on-field Nilou like ever. So I don't think it's good. And then Harbinger, no. I mean, Sapwood is fine, it's just hard to get your rotations to actually get it to be that useful, but it's probably still better than Sack, so Sapwood, okay. Is Jade Cutter not good for Bloom? The 20% HP, so it's 27% Bloom damage, which means that it's 860 more damage on your Blooms, which can be good, but a 165 EM on Iron Sting, it gives you about 100 on Nilou herself. They're both okay. I guess Jade Cutter is a bit more brain dead to use because it works even if Nilou doesn't get Blooms, even if you're getting Dendro trigger. Maybe putting it slightly higher is fine. Good in Vape, okay in Bloom. But the 20% HP that you get from it is just not that much, basically. And it feels bad to use it on Nilou instead of someone else. In any case, this would probably what I would correct it to. And 2-piece TOM. Okay, her personal damage in Bloom teams isn't very good, which, yeah, I mean, okay. This, yeah, kind of stand by. Generally, there's going to be a better user for Deepwood because your Dendro units are generally not doing that much Bloom trigger, but you can still use Deepwood on her if it's difficult to fit it on a different unit. And other than that, generally, you're going to want 2-piece TOM, 2-piece Flex, and that 2-piece Flex ideally will likely be either Wanderers or Gilded Dreams, just for the 80 Elemental Mastery, because it's better than the other options, because you're not spending a lot of time on field, so the Hydro damage wouldn't do much, whereas you are still getting some Blooms, so the Elemental Mastery is actually useful. You can also just go 4-piece TOM, but obviously your ring doesn't refresh the TOM buff because it doesn't deal damage. So you can go 4-piece TOM and then snapshot an ability right after you use her E. But in general, I think that her most general set will be 2-piece TOM, 2-piece Wanderers, or Gilded. Full target? Yeah, this I kind of stand by. It's just go triple HP, like basically every time. If you're playing her in Vape teams, you can go HP damage crit though, obviously. If you're just trying to get a nuke on her burst, there's a possibility that you might get better results if you go EM damage crit than HP damage crit, if you're just wanting to get a big Vape on her burst. But as a general rule, if you're playing Vape or just Taser teams or whatever, I would recommend HP damage crit. Then we get to teams. Hydro Trigger Bloom, decent, but want Nahida and Kokomi. Yeah, I kind of stand by that. All of these Bloom teams are obviously pretty niche, so you want to make sure that you are using them in their niche, but when they are in their niche, they're quite good. Arguably more than decent. When it comes to like how strong she is and like her pull value, I would expect her to be a relatively low value pull in general that could be a high value pull on specific accounts that already have the tools to make her work. I can clarify a little bit. This current Abyss is really good for Nilou, and so for that specifically, she has some pull value. If you're thinking more medium term and you're a relatively new account, you're not interested in doing an Abyss speedrun, you just want to have good teams, she won't always shine as much as she shines right now. And more specifically, because she is a niche unit, sometimes she'll be in her niche and sometimes she won't. If you already have a team that can replace her when she's not in her niche, then she can have a pretty high amount of pull value, because when you are in her niche, you play Nilou, and when you're not in her niche, you play something else. But if you don't already have another team that's pretty built, doing well, good generalist team that maybe isn't as good in AoE, so you could replace it with Nilou when you're in AoE. If you don't already have a team like that, then Nilou's pull value really tanks, and so it might be better for you to hold off for more generalist units and then get Nilou on her rerun. If you already have strong teams, then you already have the generalist stuff, and getting the niche stuff is actually good for your account, because getting the niche stuff means that when you're in that niche, you can go for that team and then go to a different team. Overall, her pull value is very variable depending on the current state of your account and what you want to be doing in the future. I wouldn't say that she's a unit that I would generally recommend, but she is most definitely one of the strong stronger units that have been released, in the sense that her teams, when they work, they are actually very, very strong, which means that every once in a while, you'll have abysses or chambers or whatever, where Nilou is just kind of the best team you can use there. And that's obviously quite good. I would probably say that your Primogems would be better spent on Nahida and then trying to get her on her rerun if you don't have the Primogems to guarantee both. But at the end of the day, all of this to say, Nilou's pretty good. I stand by what I said, that she's good but niche. So overall, for Nilou stuff, I'd say that the non-Nahida stuff I was mostly on the money on. The Nahida stuff I was kind of off. This is probably my least accurate pre-release so far, so I'm sorry about that. I do hope the post-release can correct the places where I was wrong, and make sure you watch post-releases and don't just base your decision to pull it around the pre-release. Yeah, I'll see you guys around.